Hello everyone, this is Bob and Threadbare, and welcome to a new video series that I'm calling Weaving Worlds. Since the real Bob and Threadbare was from the video game Loom, and is part of the Guild of Weavers, you see, and just go and play the game Loom. It's on Steam. The point is, I'll be providing advice for people who want to create a setting. Maybe you want to write a speculative fiction book. Maybe you're running a role-playing game and you want to build a unique setting, or maybe you draw a webcomic and want to flesh out your ideas some more. There are a dozen reasons why you'd want to build your own fantasy or science fiction setting, and I happen to know quite a lot about both. I've created a few settings myself, and between all that research and experience, I thought that maybe I'd be able to help a few of you folks out there. So let's get straight into it with the topic of today's video: 7 ways to handle divinity that aren't just polytheism. So, you may have noticed that fantasy settings with a divine presence, as in settings with a god or gods who impact the plot, in those settings, polytheism tends to be the most common approach. There are multiple real gods who bicker and fight with each other, and usually there's one evil god who wants to take over, end, or destroy the world. And that's all well and good, and there are plenty of polytheistic religions that you can use for inspiration and research. But even if your gods have weird names and even weirder associations, the basic structure of your setting's divinities will be the same as everyone else's. To me, that feels like a wasted opportunity, because there are so many alternatives that also have a basis in historical beliefs. So here are a few of those other approaches to divinity that could help your setting stand out. Number 1. Monotheism. Monotheism is another fairly common sight in fantasy settings, but I feel like it's often overlooked in role-playing games unless it's baked into the default setting. Now, I doubt I need to tell you how monotheism works. Even if you aren't a believer, roughly half the world's population is Christian or Muslim, so it's hard to avoid. But for the sake of thoroughness, monotheism means that you believe only one true God exists and deserves your faith and worship. I believe that many fantasy authors avoid the monotheistic approach because their audience will inevitably compare it to Christianity, Islam, or Judaism. And those comparisons will be there, because those religions are how we understand monotheism. Another reason fantasy authors in particular avoid monotheism is because it invokes a philosophical paradox. If God exists, if he is all-powerful and can perform obvious miracles to help his believers, then why do his believers still suffer? As the author, you don't have to answer that question, since we don't have all of the answers here in real life, but you can if you want to. Maybe your setting's god isn't all-powerful, maybe he isn't all-loving, or maybe he does help a chosen few, and your story will be about the unlucky ones he ignores. Another reason why setting creators stay away from monotheism is because role-playing games like Dungeons & Dragons assume that your setting will be polytheistic, and so they build game mechanics like cleric domains around that idea. However, you can have clerics with multiple domains all worshipping the same god. Christianity alone has 3 major branches: Catholicism, Orthodoxy, and Protestantism. And just within Catholicism, you have several monastic orders like the Benedictines, the Trappists, the Dominicans, and the Franciscans. Each one has its own approach to a religious life, and so clerics in D&D who worship different gods in a polytheistic setting could belong to different religious orders or religious sects in a monotheistic setting. One other thing is that monotheism is compatible with a polytheistic setting. The way it would work is that a particular culture will acknowledge that other gods exist, but they believe that only one god deserves their worship. For instance, the Dark Elves of Dungeons & Dragons all worship the god Lolth, but they are fully aware that other gods exist for other cultures, and in fact other Dark Elf gods have also existed in the past. However, for the majority of Dark Elves, only Lolth is worth following. Number 2. Embodied Gods. An embodied god is a god that you can meet in person. They have a body that you can touch, and you can talk with them like you would talk with any other person. They aren't just some figure in the sky or a burning bush. They exist within the world, and you can go visit them where they live. An embodied god could look like a normal person, or they could be a giant that towers over mortal humans, or they could be something that isn't a human at all, like an animal, a massive tree, or a tall mountain. The point is that an embodied god is present, and if you can reach them, you can ask him, her, or it all of those big philosophical questions that you've been wondering. Embodied gods can make your setting unique because of how approachable your gods are, and your gods are also more vulnerable, assuming that gods in your setting can be vulnerable. Number 3. Ascended Mortals. The idea of the ascended mortal is that a normal human or any other reasoning creature can become a god. Heracles is the classic example. He died, as any mortal would, but upon his death he ascended to become the Greek god of strength, at least in some versions of the story. In the Forgotten Realms, one of the basic settings for Dungeons & Dragons, there are several mortals who ascended to godhood in both the setting's past and its present. The gods Cyric, Kelemvor, and Mystra were all part of the same adventuring party once upon a time. In the Greyhawk setting, powerful beings like Ayuz and Vecna ascended to godhood. By adding ascended mortals to your setting's divinities, you do 2 things. First, you create the ultimate path of upward mobility. It may not be easy, and you may need some divine blood in the first place, but a divinity that includes ascended mortals allows you to tell stories about naked ambition, power, and responsibility, or else you can use it as the greatest possible reward for a lifetime of struggle and success. Ascended mortals also make the gods more approachable. Gods who have lived a mortal life can better empathize with their followers, and their followers can better understand their gods. Number 4. God Kings and God Queens. A God King or God Queen is a living person who is worshipped as the embodiment of a god. It's a little of number 2 and a little of number 3, but with an extra twist. The king or queen is mortal and can die, and after they die, whoever takes up the job next becomes the new embodiment of the god. This is how it worked in ancient Egypt, at least during some of the 3,000 years it existed. In life, the pharaoh was the embodiment of Horus, son of the high god Osiris, and upon his death, the old pharaoh would become the new incarnation of Osiris, while his son would become the new Horus. In a fantasy setting, a god king or god queen has a lot of story potential. Not only is this god embodied, they're also politically active, a head of state whose worshippers are also their citizens. As a god in a fantasy setting, this ruler can wield immense amounts of power, and so you do have to ask the question, why has this god not conquered the world already? There might be a divine truce. The god king might not be as powerful as he looks. He might have a lot of equally powerful rivals. Or maybe he only has power within a certain area. Or maybe the God Queen has taken over the world. Number 5. Imperial Cults. During the height of the Roman Empire, the Greek and Egyptian regions would obey and respect the Roman Emperor the same way they obeyed and respected the gods. This led to the establishment of the Imperial Cult. Subjects would worship the office of the Roman Emperor and the Roman gods above all other gods, and the most respected of emperors could ascend to divine status after their death. This approach makes religion political the way a god king or god queen does, but the objects of worship are the state and dead emperors, not any living mortal. An imperial cult in your setting allows you to add a whole bunch of ascended mortals to your list of gods. This list of imperial gods can also double as a history of the empire itself. Number 6. Celestial Gods. In ancient Babylon, astrologers connected the planets to their gods. This practice would later influence Greek and Roman astrology, and so today we have planet names like Mercury, Venus, Mars, and Jupiter, all Roman gods. However, this was actually a very unusual practice. In most other areas, planets were identified as moving stars, and while they were significant, they were not divine. In China and Japan, for instance, the 5 visible planets are named after the 5 Chinese elements. In most fantasy pantheons, you also don't see many links between planets and gods. But why should that stop you? You can create an entire solar system to go with your fantasy world, and name each planet after a god. You can use the movement and color of planets to inform what the gods are like. And if you feel like introducing space travel, you could even have characters flying over to the planets to meet the gods who live there, or to find that they're barren and empty. Up to you. Number 7. Atheistic Philosophy. Now this is an interesting one. Atheistic philosophy is the idea that you don't need a god telling you what to do in order to become a good person. If the gods are distant and hard to contact in your setting, or if religion just doesn't exist, then an atheistic philosophy is easy enough to come by. But what if the gods do exist? What if the evidence that they exist is as irrefutable as a priest parting the ocean, or an embodied god who's always willing to answer questions? How does atheism exist in that kind of world? Here's the thing. A person might agree that gods are real, but not agree that gods deserve worship and faith. Think of it like how a person can agree that the United States of America exists, but not agree that living in the States is better than living in Canada. Or like how a person might have a father, but not think that that father deserves any love or respect from them. An atheist in a world where the gods are provably real doesn't think that miracles are smoke and mirrors. What they think is that being a god does not entitle you to worship. And depending on how the gods in your setting act, they might be right. 7 up and 7 down, but we're not done yet. I also have 3 bonuses, 3 things that you can add to your setting's divine map that are almost gods, but not quite. So let's continue. Bonus 1. Animism. Animism is the idea that spirits dwell in everything. Animals, plants, rocks, rivers, everything. These spirits don't have the power of gods, but they are more powerful than mortals, especially when you're dealing with the rock, river, or animal in question. With animism in your setting, characters are constantly dealing with spirits. They'll ask a river spirit for safe passage. They'll ask an animal spirit to forgive them for killing them. And they'll ask the tree spirits where the bandits are hiding in the woods. Bonus 2. Ancestor Worship. Cultures that worship or revere their ancestors have a strong emphasis on burying or otherwise keeping dead family members together, taking care of their graveyards or tombs, speaking with them regularly, and leaving sacrifices or offerings for their spirits to enjoy. Ancestor spirits are different from ascended mortals because ancestors don't have the power of gods, and the living often deal with them collectively. An animist religion will usually include ancestor worship, but ancestor worshippers don't have to go as far as animism. Bonus 3. Reverence. Reverence is similar to worship, but the relationship is more about respect than it is about prayer, faith, and sacrifice. Catholic Christians revere the saints, but they don't think that the saints are gods. Buddhists revere Siddhartha Buddha, but they don't consider him a god. The distinction can get blurry, but the point is that your setting has something between gods and mortals, something that deserves respect, but not complete obedience. Because of this distinction, an atheistic philosophy can revere entities that they don't believe deserve worship. So, those are my 10 total ideas for how to make your setting's gods and religions more interesting than a simple list of names and churches. If you're feeling particularly creative, you could fit all of the ideas into the same setting at once, but then it would get pretty hectic and confused. But hey, that would just make it more realistic, wouldn't it? Thanks for joining me for today's journey into weaving worlds. Please like, share, and subscribe because that raises my visibility here on YouTube. Check out my other stuff if you have some time, and I hope I'll see you again for the next video.